Greetings, everyone. My name is Samantha Conrad, and I'm here with the Depot, the Democracy and Public Policy Research Network, here at BGSU. And today we are interviewing esteemed author Colin Woodard. Nice to have you on today.
My pleasure.
We are going to be talking about Colin Woodard's book. He is at BGSU promoting. And I'm going to start off with the question. Could you kind of walk me through your career a little bit? Like, where did you get your start, and how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, I'm kind of a product of liberal arts education, I guess you could say. I graduated from high school in 1987, so in that era it was Mikhail Gorbachev was the leader of the Soviet Union, and there was this perestroika and glasnost campaigns, and it seemed like the Manichaean struggle between East and West with nuclear arms that had dominated my childhood, that maybe there'd be a shift in that world. So I gravitated, once I got to university, into Soviet East European studies. So I was a East European Balkan history person. And if you do the math, my junior year was 1989, and I went behind the Iron Curtain. I went on an exchange program in Budapest, Hungary, and I arrived and it was communism. And by the time I left a few months later, all the revolutions had happened. The Berlin Wall had fallen, and been fortunate enough to see many of those events firsthand. And that was, I ended up going back the following summer and then going back again after I graduated and staying in that region or studying that region throughout my 20s, throughout the 1990s. And that was a laboratory for, how identity and national identity work, how stories that people and leaders tell people affects the way they conceive of themselves and their place in the world and who their friends and enemies are. It was a time when people were trying to create democratic societies, liberal democracies, small l, small d, where none had ever existed, or if they had existed, it hadn't been since the 1930s, before the Soviet annexations. And all the difficulties involved in that. And then the bad actors, demagogues, telling big lies to get people to do terrible things. You had ethnic conflict, cynical actors like the leadership in Romania after the revolution, trying to cause ethnic Hungarians and Romanians in Transylvania to attack each other. The guy in Slovakia, the sort of strong man, a guy named Vladimir Mečiar, trying to do same thing with the Hungarian minority in South Slovakia. And then most successfully, Slobodan Milosevic with the Bosnian War, breaking apart a country and causing a sort of genocide and a siege that ended the European dream of post-Cold War peace and prosperity pretty promptly before it began. So I was there for all of that kind of stuff, which was sort of a laboratory for a lot of the work I actually do now. I'd had this incredible training experience. Then I'd stayed on most of that time as a foreign correspondent, because I didn't have any money or resources, but A, people would pay me to go around and witness what was happening anyway, and B, if you're a journalist and you go knock on the door to talk to some important person, they'll talk to you, whereas if you're not, they don't have any reason to. So it was a fantastic career. I stayed on with that, moved to the DC area and was a globetrotting correspondent all over the world, on the Pacific and South America and Central America and all over the place, to get a sort of global perspective. And then started writing books, basically books of history. My first one was about the environmental crisis in the oceans, but with a lot of humans and history in it. And then did a history of my home state of Maine and why we Mainers are so strange in the way we are. What is it about our history that made this place I'd grown up in? And then a book on the pirates, because I knew that the colonial history of the United States, as I started learning more and more about it, was essential to understanding American life today. And having written this book about the Golden Age pirates, I then did a book that's part of what I talked about at Bowling Green State last night, as we're speaking now, called American Nations, which shows that we've always been this balkanized federation, a bit like Yugoslavia, because the rival colonial projects that formed on the eastern and southwestern rims of what's the United States, these rival colonies were set up by people at different times with completely different religious and ethnographic and ideological characteristics. They weren't all on the same page. In fact, they didn't expect to be in the same country together. Some of them were, so some of these colonies were Dutch. Some of them were French, and even the British ones. The Puritans in New England, who believed they were like a covenanted people like in the Old Testament Hebrews, right, that God had chosen them to go do things in the New England wilderness. That's a completely different approach than the second and third and fourth sons of the great country aristocratic families in England, the sons who weren't going to inherit the manor estate at home, who were going to Virginia to recreate like English feudal manners, right? Conservative reproduction of their society. So all of these colonies were completely different, and the characteristics have been present in certain respects throughout our history, and they settled mutually exclusive bands of the United States. Each of these, once you know these colonial cultures, each of them settled their own settlement bands, avoiding and competing with one another, dividing places like Ohio. Ohio was settled by 3 east-west bands of settlement, one with origins originally in New England and the others with origins elsewhere, like Kentucky and Virginia, which you can see on a county level map of election results and many other things today. So that and the following books that I work on and study now are interdisciplinary works that deal with the problems of American nationhood, I guess you could say. And how do you solve for them? How do you hold a country together, a country that's committed to these promises in the Declaration of Independence, really, that you're trying to create a society where individual humans can be as free as possible, maximally but sustainably free over time, that, something nobody had tried before. That's the story of how do you do that, especially when it's in challenge and crisis, given that you have this fractured, balkanized nationscape, and that some of the regional cultures have been opposed to the Declaration over time, and others have different takes on it. That's the core of my work. And that requires, anthropology and history and sociology and political science, and being interdisciplinary and working with people across disciplines and fields to try to integrate that stuff. So yeah, very much a liberal arts approach to things.
And I know that you are an expert on, as you've just described, American regionalism. What has if you could just give a brief history of like what that's looked like in the United States, and I know you've gone over this a little bit, but maybe elaborate a bit more on how that fits into the context of your book.
Yeah, so the fact that we have these separate regional cultures, and again, they don't follow state boundaries, like I said, with Ohio or Pennsylvania or Illinois or California or Texas, there are strong different tectonic plates, different regional cultures settle different parts of the state, which make joint action contentious in a way that it's not in Utah or Vermont or places that are only part of one regional culture. But that said, that's the story of our history, the effort to try to hold a fractious coalition of regions together. That's why we don't have a national government, we have a federal government. We're a federation, because the regional cultures, even back at the time of the Revolution and the drafting of the Constitution, didn't trust one another. If you read the founders, if you go to the Federalists, the papers that the founders were writing, their big concern is that if you didn't create a lasting federation, that the colonies would go to war against each other. They knew that was the choice, union or division. And they were right very quickly, because by the 1860s, there was a civil war. But that was because these regions didn't see eye to eye on many fundamental things, including their constitutional arrangements and whether or not the Declaration's purpose, that we're tasked to secure one another's natural liberties over time, that was rejected by some regions. Like the Deep South all their political leaders and intellectual leaders said, nonsense, the Declaration's wrong. Jefferson was wrong when he wrote those words. Humans aren't equal, right? In fact, the only people who can achieve the promises of self-government in the Declaration are the allegedly superior Anglo-Saxon race. That's literally what they said and wrote and argued for, that drove the struggles between the regions, the sections, in the antebellum period, the Civil War itself, Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era. The story of our history is the story of that. Regions and the battle over the purpose of the whole, between an ethno-nationalism and a civic nationalism.
And how does this conflict between civic nationalism and obviously regionalism, how does that, I guess, factor into kind of what you discuss in your book about the good of the collective versus individual needs?
So all of these, if your mission of your country, as ours was in its opening statement, is to try to create a society where humans can be maximally and sustainably free, the immediate question is how to do that. And the different regional cultures had different takes on it. One take was, well, the way you make a free society is to maximize the autonomy and freedom of action of the individual, that it's all about freeing the individual from the constraints of institutions and the government and anybody else. Like the less government, less regulation, less taxes, axiomatically will make each of us individuals more free because it's us and the tyrannical king is kind of the model. And then there was another approach that said, no, the fact that individuals could even dream of being free, 5,000 years of human, history as having advanced civilizations, it took that long for people to even conceive of the idea that individuals could be free. Medieval thought we were all part of a collective, right? If you look at the medieval English thinkers, it's that the king, that we're part of one body and the king is the head, and the soldiers are one arm and the tax collectors the other, and the peasants are the feet that make everything move, and the soul is the priesthood, right? It wasn't that you're individuals, it's that you're all part of one organism. That's the default. And it's, not free, not democratic, that despotism and autocracy were the human norm throughout much of our life once you had civilizations going. So that was the background. So in this other philosophy, it's an incredible achievement. It was only possible for us in the past 400 years to conceive of this because we built up the infrastructure and the possibility of humans being free and maintaining freedom. Executing the American experiment requires that you maintain the things, the leveling mechanisms that make it possible for each person at birth to have any shot at being meaningfully free. You need to have the public education and infrastructure and, Pell Grants and universities and healthcare in order to cultivate and maintain a Republican citizenry and make it possible to have a liberal democracy where the people are sovereign, right? That it's a collective, shared endeavor. So those are two, if you think that maintaining freedom is about maximizing the individual and that government is tyrannical, or you think that you need to have these common good investments for each to be free, those are opposite policy applications. So each side, if you will, sees what the other is doing is imperiling freedom. And the answer is that ultimately, both of those things are important. If you completely ignore individual liberty, you end up with the scenes that I saw in communist Eastern Europe. Truly horrible, right? People having no role in their lives and being stuck as part of a crazy machine that has no accountability and doesn't generate great results for anybody. But you go in the other direction, if you go individual liberty all the way and the government withers away, there's no referee anymore. Might makes right. And you don't end up in a situation where everyone's wonderfully free. What happens is a few families maximize their freedom and take it away from everyone else, creating an aristocracy, which is what's happened every time you've had that. Hungary in the medieval period did that. And you had, a state collapse follow shortly thereafter. Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala in the late 20th century, same thing. The 10 families or the 8 families always capitalized, owned everything. The land, the judges, the army, and then everyone else, got in the way would be gotten rid of. Also very brittle. They were toppled and, once the narcotics trade took over, now, you have state failure in a lot of those places. So that's, what I'm saying is both extremes are bad, and American Character, the book that I was speaking about here at the university, argues that if going to the extreme, one gets you to Orwell and the other one gets you to an oligarchy, then logically somewhere there's a balance point where those two important forces, individual liberty and the common good, are in balance. When you're at that equilibrium point, that's where your liberal democracy, your small l, small d, is operating optimally. And the problem is that's really hard to do, right? Humans have only been trying to do this stuff for 400 years, and we're really bad at it because you've got to keep it at the 50-yard line in changing circumstances. And if you don't, you're going to start drifting off and endangering freedom and tyranny. And what we've done over the past 40, 50 years, the United States has progressively gone more and more on the individualism side of the spectrum to the point where it's created massive gaps, not just in wealth, but in everything from the tax code to what happens if you break the law? Everyone knows that a poor person, a rich person, it's not the same at all, whether you get convicted or what your punishments are. Everything is geared to the point where the entire social contract is fraying. That people, whether you're on the left or the right, whether it was the Occupy movement or the Tea Party or Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump's support, came out of the sense that the system is not working for people and that cheaters way up there at the top or below you, stealing welfare payments or, getting bailouts for crashing the world economy, whatever direction you're looking, the idea is that cheaters are stealing and destroying your future and that the game is being rigged. And that's when you start having people's confidence in the liberal democracy start coming apart. And that's what happened. We had a collapse point, and now we're even beyond the discussion about how best do we execute the promise of the Declaration. Now the question that's being asked is, are we going to be a free society or not? Which is not a position you want to be in. The hours become late, and now we have a new struggle. But if we survive the current crisis, and it's definitely a crisis, the way in the middle and long term that we right the ship is to restore that balance point. And the book talks about, given our regional cultures and their proclivities and their past experiences, it sets out a program for how you would create a super majority of the regional cultures could get on board. What's the Venn diagram that gives you a lasting majority that can guide the country in the longer term, to good, I guess you could say, to executing the promises in the Declaration.
And how do you think all of this, like the history of the regionalism in the United States and kind of like the differing ways that people think you should approach the concept of freedom, how do you think that has contributed to like our current political climate today, which is one of obvious polarization?
Oh yeah, well it does because of, like I said just before, the way that you create the conditions for demagoguery and collapse to happen is to destroy the social contract and people's trust that things are working or that democracy works or that the system works. And we've done that, right? Successively, administrations from both parties, has decided that even though the economy and the situation's not working for 40-50% of the population, that's okay. Just go get retrained, move. I mean, it's not just here in the United States, right? This has happened simultaneously in liberal democracies all over the place. The United Kingdom with Brexit and the rise of the right in many European countries is all following the same pattern. If you get your balance wrong and you're allowing all assets to accrue to essentially an aristocracy and oligarchy, and that the ladders of opportunity that make it possible for each of us to achieve our potential are clearly not there, and that there's no way that if you're born in unprivileged circumstances that you can get to the top anymore. That's what fonders revolution ultimately. But it also sets up situations like in Eastern Europe after the collapse of communism, which was a profound collapse for most people. The shock therapy programs had wiped out people's pensions, investments, savings. Their money was worthless. Their jobs were gone. That was a perfect climate for demagogues to step in with simple answers, right? Hate the Martians, hate the purple people, whatever it is, to move themselves into power. And so that's a dangerous realm that you don't want to end up in. But you carry things too far and then your balance is off, then you end up in a crisis.
Yes, and we're currently seeing that.
We're absolutely in a
United
crisis,
States.
yes. I mean, as we're speaking now, yes, we're already in a constitutional crisis. I mean, the examples from, as we're recording this interview more recently, I mean, you have, if you're a presidential administration and you want to get rid of the United States Agency for International Development or you want to get rid of the Department of Education, that's your prerogative, but the way it works under the Constitution is those are departments that were created by law by the legislative branch in Congress and were funded, and the laws that passed the funding have happened. The executive branch, the president, and certainly the world's richest man just anointed as a citizen to walk in the door, do not have the power to close those departments under the Constitution. The current president's party is in charge of both houses of Congress. You could go try to pass a bill and have it go, and if you get your let's say senators and the House to pass it, then there you go. But what's happening now is just closing by fiat, that it ceases to exist. That doesn't belong to the president, that belongs to the American people, and you're violating tons of laws, and not only do you know that by looking at the Constitution, but as we're recording this, every single judge from Trump appointees and Reagan appointees and yes, Obama appointees and others have said this is unconstitutional, you can't do this anymore, and sent out injunctions. So we're already at a state where obvious illegal activity is happening. The question is, the next step will be, will the executive branch and the president comply with the judge's orders? So if they don't, who makes them? That's what, if you're a scholar of authoritarianism, that's the next step, is that they say, no, make me. And there's the answer. If the answer is no one can make you, then you're not living in a democracy anymore. So that we're right at the precipice of that.
How do you think the American people could be able to come together and, I guess, agree on a way to run the country, or what would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, if we retreat back from the brink we're at now, and we start talking about how do you execute the American experiment, how do you create and maintain a free society, ultimately what I say in the book is, with this collection of regional cultures, some of which are highly individualistic, individual liberty oriented, the United States is never, some societies, like the balance point is going to be different in every society, right? Japan's balance point between individual freedom and the common good will be different than Australia's. And ours is hard because we have these multiple countries, if you will, that don't agree. But that means that in our configuration, some countries in Western Europe that are very successful go to social democracy. That's not socialism. Social democracy is, you have a totally free, rambling free market economy, but you tax it to divert the wealth to invest in all the public shared goods that make your economy and your society work. That's the model in Denmark and Iceland and Sweden and Switzerland and many of the countries that organizations like the World Bank and the Cato Institute say are the most successful free economies have these characteristics. But we can never get to social democracy because in aggregate, we're so individualistic that any effort to go to that stage always gets pushed back. We had, FDR was trying to do stuff like that, control prices during parts of the New Deal. Lyndon Baines Johnson's Great Society was trying to solve, housing problems directly by the federal government going in and building housing complexes. They thought they knew more than they did, but the pushback politically was enormous. So you can't go that far, but you can go several notches from where we are now to a direction where you do have buy-in. And that looks like this. It's that the American way that these regions can agree on is that we're a society devoted to the free and fair competition of individuals and institutions and their ideas, and may the best one win, and that will create a dynamic and innovative society where we can both be free and succeed. That's the ethos. And that there's broad agreement on that ethos, but it has to be free and fair. And the fair part means that government, as the referee, has to be strong enough and committed to actually enforcing the rules, so that you don't have cheaters at the bottom, sure, but cheaters at the top have more consequence, who are making it impossible for a market to function, right? Trying to monopolize it or cheat on things or lead us to the 2008 financial collapse or the subprime mortgage market. The people who did those things should have been in jail. They weren't, right? The rest of us bailed it out. And people know that. That was the sort of source, the underlying furnace of anger that got us to this final stage. So you need that balance. Yes, we believe may the best person win, but stop the cheaters so that the best person can win. So a new entrant can enter the market, so that someone born without any privileges or in poverty, who's smart and has their energy, actually has a way and a ladder to do whatever it is they want to do, whether it's getting an education or being able to start a new business, that you have those opportunities. And that requires, because it's not there's the king and there's us, and if the king is weak, then we are free. No, there's the king and there's us and there's the aristocracy. There was the medieval period and the early modern period. There's an oligarchy now. There are three poles to worry about. And, in medieval thought, often if the king got weak, life for the ordinary people got terrible because the nobility who owned the land would crush them, right? So there's more complexity there than the individualist argument the government is not your only possible, tormentor, and you got to keep all those forces in balance.
And do you think it's possible to like restore that equilibrium or make it to where there is a free market that people can compete and still have fair outcomes?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've done it in the past. I mean, not to glorify the past, but the Greater New Deal project, which extended all the way to 1964, like look back to the, the supposed golden age of the 1950s, where everything was wonderful and conventional thought, right? Eisenhower administration. That was very much public goods. That's when public universities were created all over the country, where the GI Bill was making it possible for returning soldiers of working class background to go get jobs. There was like opportunity, but we were investing heavily in basic science. We were, building the rocketry programs that would send people to the moon. We were building the interstate highway system and, big common good investments. And it worked. And it kept the country able to stand up in the Manichaean, the great struggle against the Soviet Union. All of those things were happening then, and there was bipartisan consensus, right? The FDR's New Deal, Eisenhower didn't reverse it. Eisenhower had been commander of Allied forces in the Normandy invasion in Europe and understood that you needed the common project working together in order to make things function. The stakes were very high then. So yeah, we can do that. Now, in that era, of course, all sorts of people were excluded from the New Deal and from that inherited long New Deal, right? The deal that had to be made by FDR to get the New Deal passed at a time, right? The Deep South and Tidewater were one-party states, right, by design. And that meant at a time when committee chairs in the Senate and the House were based on seniority, if you're a one-party state and there is no competing party, essentially, then you're going to stay in the Senate as long as you want. So all of the committees are basically controlled by the South. So the only way that FDR's New Deal legislation in the height of the Great Depression could get through was by brokering deals with those regional cultures. And the deal was, we will write these programs such that African American people in the southern regions won't have access to any of it. We'll exclude, get all these industrial protections and stuff, but not for people who work in agricultural processing, and not for, domestic servants. And, it was intentionally written out large numbers of people from any of those benefits. So obviously you will not repeat it that way, right? But the essential idea of there being that kind of balance point where things do in fact work, the economy works, society works, people are happy and healthy, that model lies somewhere, between where we are now and social democracy. There is a space where things work much better, opportunity is much greater, and people are freer. So that's where we need to get to.
And do you think that there is a way, like what kind of do those policies look like in your mind in order to like restore this idea of equilibrium? And do you think it would be possible for, at this point, American people to even agree on what those would be?
I think so. I mean, the dominant regional cultures, in the Deep South and Greater Appalachia may be harder to convince, but you take all the other regional cultures would agree on it, and you've got a supermajority, at a federal level in Congress and stuff to pass the legislation. So, I mean, not everybody will be completely happy, but, 3/4 of the regional cultures will be. And that program would be you invest in basic science. You invest in your public university systems, not cut them, and in, childhood education and Pell Grants and all of the stuff that makes it possible that each of us, when we're born, has a chance to be meaningfully free and pursue our happiness. Because that's the deal. If you have everything accrue into families, that by definition starts creating an aristocracy, which is the opposite of the whole plan. It's the intergenerational maintenance of opportunity that requires these leveling mechanisms. So you need more resources to do that. You will probably have to raise the taxes on wealthier people, on the higher marginal income tax levels. But we have room to maneuver. They're very low now. They've been cut over and over and over again. For instance, 1952, under Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower and a Republican, I think it was a Republican Senate, if not a House, the highest marginal tax rate was 92%. Today, I think it's 37. So I'm not saying go to 92%, but I'm saying there's a lot of room for increasing that marginal tax rate on the highest band of income that would allow you to build this infrastructure, which would make our democracy, make us more free, make our democracy work better, and make our economy work better. So perhaps we ought to do that. We have the proof of concept because we've done it in the past, and you can go out in the rest of the world and see which countries' economies are most successful that are free societies, and you'll see a pattern emerging as to a relationship between communitarian investment and economic success and social happiness. It's a triple win.
Perfect. Thank you for being here, Mr. Woodard. Thank you for doing the interview with us. This has been Samantha Conrad having a conversation with Mr. Woodard about his book, American Character. Thank you so much for watching, and be sure to follow The Depot on all our social media. And thank you so much for being here, Mr. Woodard.
Thanks for having me.